Henry Ford, Industrialist. Not Agitator. Why he did more for the material advancement of black Americans than most professional civil rights advocates of his era in the popular imagination. The champions of black progress in the first half of the 20th century are almost always the orators, the marchers, the lawyers, and the protest leaders. Their names dominate the textbooks and their moral claims are unassailable. Yet when judged by the metric that matters most to ordinary people, actual jobs that paid real money, offered a path out of poverty, and allowed families to eat, own homes, and educate their children. One man who never marched, never gave a fiery sermon, and never filed a lawsuit towers above nearly all of them. Henry Ford, at a time when most American corporations either excluded black workers entirely or relegated them to the lowest paying, most dangerous jobs at half the white wage, Ford did something radical. He hired black men by the thousands and paid them exactly the same wage as white men doing the same work. When the famous 5 nows a day wage was announced in 1914, it applied without regard to race. By the late 1920s, roughly 1 out of every 10 workers at Ford's River Rouge complex, the largest industrial facility in the world, was black, a proportion far higher than at General Motors, U.S. Steel, or any other major manufacturer in Detroit. The destination of the Great Migration, the Ford Motor Company became the single greatest engine of black economic ascent. This was not charity. It was calculated self-interest. Ford needed reliable labor for the most grueling departments, especially the foundry, where temperatures exceeded 120 degrees and silica dust destroyed lungs. Black migrants from the South, desperate to escape sharecropping and lynching, proved willing to endure conditions that caused high white turnover. Ford gave them the same paycheck, and in return got a stable workforce. The result was mutually beneficial, not altruistic, yet the outcome for black families was transformative. A black foundry worker earning 5 nows a day in 1920 could buy a house in Detroit, send children to school, and build wealth at a rate unimaginable in the Jim Crow South or in most northern factories. While prominent civil rights organizations of the era were filing lawsuits to desegregate a handful of graduate schools or protesting lynching with resolutions and pamphlets, Ford was quietly putting tens of thousands of black men on a middle-class trajectory. The NAACP's legal victories were morally righteous and historically necessary, but in the 1920s they directly improved the lives of perhaps a few dozen black professionals. Ford's payroll, by contrast, improved the lives of entire black neighborhoods in Detroit, Inkster, and River Rouge. Ford went further than wages. He sent recruiters to the South, funded vocational training, built a modern laboratory at Tuskegee Institute, endowed the George Washington Carver Foundation, and employed hundreds of Tuskegee graduates in his plants. When Carver, frail and in his late 70s, could no longer climb stairs, Ford paid to install an elevator in his dormitory. These were not public relations gestures. They were sustained institutional commitments that outlasted any single protest campaign of the period. None of this erases Ford's flaws. His plants were racially stratified in practice. Black workers were overrepresented in the worst jobs and almost never promoted to management. His newspaper spewed anti-Semitic poison. He fought unions bitterly, and some black workers were used as strikebreakers. Yet these undeniable sins must be weighed against a simple fact. When a black migrant stepped off the train in Detroit in 1925, the employer most likely to offer him dignity, a living wage, and a future was Henry Ford. Not the Urban League, not the NAACP, and not the federal government. Moral purity is easy when one has no payroll to meet. Changing the material conditions of an entire people is hard, and it usually requires compromise with imperfect men and institutions. Ford was deeply imperfect, but he delivered something more valuable than speeches or court victories: opportunity at scale in the hierarchy of what actually lifted black Americans out of destitution in the first half of the 20th century. The assembly line at River Rouge belongs near the very top, far above most of the celebrated protest movements that dominate our historical memory. The lesson is straightforward and uncomfortable. The greatest friends of black economic progress have often been hard-headed industrialists who saw profit in black labor, not saintly activists demanding justice in the abstract. Henry Ford was no saint. He was, however, one of the most effective allies ordinary black working people ever had.